Three, one, two, and three. We are recording.
Welcome again to the latest edition of Consciousness Hour. As many of you will know, I've been quite fascinated by near-death experiences and allied phenomena now for many, many years. And over the years, there's many writers I've come across and many individuals who've been researching in this area. But there's some individuals whose name kept cropping up time and time again. And one of them was Dr. R Craig Hogan. And there were various books I'd read over the years, and either his name had been mentioned or he'd been writing about, or he had written sections on these books. And it was somebody I always wanted to get in contact with, particularly because he was somebody I was quite keen to have as a guest on Consciousness Hour. Quite out of the blue, around about 6 or 7 weeks ago, Dr. Hogan actually contacts me on a conference he's having in the States. And I was absolutely delighted. So I contacted him and suggested that although I couldn't get to the conference for various reasons, it would be wonderful to have him on the show here, because some of the work he's been doing is really fascinating. And much to my delight, we now have Craig with us. Unfortunately, because the Archons have been playing with us as they usually do, even though we have all this wonderful new software, we're only going to be able to do for around about 40 minutes at the moment. But what we'll do is we'll truncate and try and get as much information out of the good doctor as we possibly can. Now, as an opening gambit, I really was, and I was talking to Craig about this earlier on, was how he ended up doing what he does, because his background is, like myself, it's not in this area, but it's something that obviously is intriguing. So Craig, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself to the listeners, and tell us a little bit how you ended up doing what you do.
Hi, Tony. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you. I've admired your work as well. So we have a mutual admiration society going here. What happened was that I had gone through the first half century of my life and then was thinking nothing about spirituality or the greater reality or anything of that sort. And I came to that half century mark in my life, and I learned that I have psychic abilities. And the first one that I realized that I had was psychometry. I could hold things in my hand. I could hold a deck of cards in my hand face down, and one by one, I could tell the suit and the number of the card. And then I learned that I have remote viewing ability. So I can sit in my office in Illinois, and somebody can put something on a table or on the top of a desk or anything, thousands of miles away. And I can sketch what it is, and I can do it very accurately. So when I found out that I had psychic abilities, I was drawn into looking at the greater reality, realizing that there's much more to life than what we see. And so as I went into it more and more, I learned more and more about the fact that we are eternal beings, that we are not confined to the brain, that the mind is not in the brain. And that led me into the fact that the afterlife is a reality. And we can communicate as easily with the afterlife as we can with people on this end of life. And all we have to do is learn the right methods to do it, and we can do it. And so that's what brought me into it.
So how did this happen? How did you spontaneously discover these skills, or was it something that somebody pointed you in that direction?
When I first found out I could do psychometry, which means holding things in your hand and realizing something about the object, I had gone to a psychic just out of on a whim and had a reading with her, and she said, you know, what you can hold things in your hand and tell things about whatever it is. And she said, go home and take a deck of cards and take the cards one by one with the deck face down so you can't see the card. Put the card on your palm, and if it feels warm, then it's red. If it feels cold, then it's black. And of course, what that was doing was just allowing the subconscious to come through with what was in my hand. And the signals were that it's warm or cold, but it wasn't really warm or cold. And so I did that, and I made two piles, and one pile was going to be the warm pile, and one pile was the cold pile. And so when I turned over the cold pile that would be black, every one of the cards was black. And when I turned over the red pile, which would be warm, everyone except one of the cards was red. And so then that showed me the fact that there is something going on here that is really unusual. And so I was led to that by a psychic. But as far as the remote viewing is concerned, I'd read a book by Graff, Tracks in a Psychic Wilderness. And it said, all you have to do remote viewing is to sit in front of a computer monitor, find a site that has targets on it, targets meaning a picture, an object, something that you can view, and empty your mind, make your mind into what he called an empty rice bowl. And so you make your mind into an empty rice bowl and you wait for it to be filled. You just concentrate on whatever it is and you wait for it to be filled. And I did it, and the first time I did it, it was astoundingly accurate, and I had no difficulty being able to do remote viewing. So in that instance, I had discovered it because of my reading, and that's what brought me into it.
So what this is doing is it's opening up your mind in some way. It's almost like a kind of a subliminal skill we have that, I mean, I find that when, I mean, I have very, very powerful hypnagogic imagery when I'm in that kind of liminal state between asleep and awake, you know, hypnagogia or hypnopompia. And I always find that if I'm starting having these images, it's very difficult. What you have to do is kind of draw them in, like they're in your periphery vision. And you have to work on them that way. And I sometimes wonder whether these kind of alternate skills or these alternate ways of perception, kind of, we can't necessarily control them in the way we would like. Now, I know from your work that you're very much interested in communicating with people that have passed on through the veil of death, or whatever we want to term it to be. So if you can spend a little bit of time, because you've spent many, many years now looking into this and researching it, what do you believe is taking place? What is the process, and what is going on here?
Yeah, it's because of the fact that we're not separated from the other people. It's as though we were sitting in an auditorium watching a movie, and we can see the movie on the screen, and we're engaged in the movie, and we're the protagonist, and we're having these happy hours, and we're having these sad hours, and we're involved in it emotionally. And at any moment, we can switch on the lights. We can switch on the lights, and we realize we're just in a theater. We have our loved ones around us. They're sitting with us, and we can just sit there and talk with them. And if we turn off the lights again, we go back into the physical reality, and then we can engage in the play that we're part of. But we can switch the lights on and off anytime we want. So all we have to do is shut down the physical reality. All we have to do is shut down our focus on the physical realm. And when we shut down our focus on the physical realm, we are immediately in the alternative realm. We're immediately in the greater realm that we're part of, that our minds are part of. But we have to do this entirely by mind. And that's one of the reasons that the physical scientists have difficulty with this, because this is not something that we can do in physical science. We can't do it through experimentation. We have to do it by relaxing the mind and allowing the mind to take over. They will take over on the other side. That's how we can have afterlife communication. So when we relax our minds away from the physical realm, they come in and take over, and they will give to us, they'll unfold to us their communication from that realm. But what we have to do is we have to relax the mind. We have to shut off that light, or turn on that light, so that we see that we're just in an auditorium with our loved ones and just have a communication with them. But the difficulty is getting people to do that and to realize that what's coming to them is not, quote, my imagination, that this is in fact unfolding from them, that they're only in, there is no space and no time. And so they're not in another space, they're not in another location, they're simply one with our mind. And if we just allow ourselves to relax into it, the communication happens all by itself.
I see. So it's rather similar. I noticed in some of your writings, in one of your books, you mention, and it's somebody I'm fascinated in, the work of Aldous Huxley and Henri Bergson and various other people who argue that the brain is in fact an attenuator, and that by opening the doors of perception, we discover the wider reality. And it seems that our brains, in order for us to exist within whatever this simulated reality is, this phaneron of existence that we're in, our brains are attuned to us perceiving that. But in doing so, it takes out the wider worldview that we ordinarily would have if we hadn't have restricted ourselves into our Plato-like cave in the sense of how we perceive things. Now, clearly, when you communicate with the dead and the way the dead can communicate, this runs totally counter to what the modern scientific model has about this.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your opinions on this when scientists say that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of brain behavior or brain patterns, it's just neurons reacting with electricity? Clearly you have a very different opinion of that. So what's your viewpoint on that?
Yeah, that the mind is independent of the brain, that the brain is just part of the scenery. So it's a prop. And the mind then interacts with the body. In other words, it uses the body, rather like an avatar. So that we use the body, but the mind is never in the body. It's never united with the body. And so what happens is that when we then drop the body and the body's no longer useful to us, the mind just keeps on going. You know, it's rather like in that auditorium that we turn on the lights and everybody gets up and walks out of the play. And then you go on and you can go into another room and have another play. And you are the same person, you are that individual. So you haven't been lost, you haven't gone into you know, a nihilistic non-existence. What happens is that you simply go into another play and you engage in another play. So we know that the mind that is outside of the brain is using the body, which is in the physical realm, but all of this is scenery, all of it's props, and we're only using this to have experiences. And the experiences then are what give us the challenges that allow us to grow, to surmount the challenges and become a different person, a new person. But we have to have the challenges. We have to have the tragedies. We have to have the loss in order to be able to grow and overcome the difficulties and become whatever it is that we're going to become. The mind, in other words, is growing and maturing through the experiences in the physical realm, but the physical realm is just scenery.
Okay, so playing devil's advocate then, what evidence have you got? Have you got hard evidence for your assumption that death is not the end and there is afterlife communications, and afterlife communications can be proven? So what evidence have you got to turn around to your standard skeptic to say, well, you know, where is your evidence on this?
Sure. We have a lot of evidence, and the evidence that we have is from communications that we receive from these individuals who are now living on another plane of existence. There are millions of these other planes, incidentally. It's not just one afterlife. And it isn't really an afterlife because it's all only life. We're on a spiritual plane right now. But the proof, we have a great variety of proof in these communications from the other side. Some of the best proof is come from Leslie Flint's archives of recordings. Leslie Flint was a medium, a direct voice medium, who lived in the 20th century. And what would happen is that Leslie Flint would sit in a room, and in a darkened room, and voices would come out of the air. And they were actually coming out of a voice box that was on his shoulder that was made out of ectoplasm. But the voices would come out of the air, and we have thousands of recordings of them now. And in some of these recordings, especially those that are called the Nanji recordings of Annie Nanji and Dr. Nanji, her husband would come in and sit in this room with Leslie Flint, just the two of them. And then Leslie Flint would then, because he's the medium, he's the one through whom this happens, he would just sit there, and he would, after a while, Annie Nanji, who had passed into spirit, who was coming on from the next plane of life, would come through and would speak to her husband, Dr. Nanji, who was sitting in the room. And they would have conversations with each other. And this happened every week or two. So they would have conversations as though they were sitting at the breakfast table talking to each other. And we have the recordings of them now. So here we have an individual who is the husband of the woman who's in spirit, speaking with her as though they were speaking over the breakfast table. They're talking about their everyday lives, about what's going on with him that she's watching from the other side. And the fact that he knows it's her, it couldn't be somebody mimicking her. You know, it is her from the other side speaking. And we have the dozens of recordings of the two of them speaking with Leslie Flint. And this is absolute proof that the fact that she is there in spirit, but she's very much alive. She's very much a part of his life. She comes into the earth plane, spends time with him, and he doesn't know it because of the fact that she's in spirit. But they have these conversations. He also has others. He has a publisher from London who had passed, and the woman comes in to speak to her husband in spirit. We had those recordings. So we have a great number of the recordings, and among all of the communications with the other side, these are the ones that are the most profound, and anybody can get on the internet and listen to them. They're available at the Leslie Flint Trust. So it's at leslieflint.com, and anybody can get on and look at the Nanji recordings and just listen to Dr. Nanji sitting with Leslie Flint, having conversations like over the breakfast table with his wife in spirit. So that's the greatest proof of the fact that the afterlife is a reality.
The people who, when the communications take place, presumably we must be in a position to develop our knowledge of the geography of wherever else it is. So what is at the other side? What the death experience? What happens after the death experience, as far as somebody leaving this plane?
Sure.
What do they experience? What happens?
Yeah, and we have these recordings and other statements by those on the other side who come through mediums, mental mediums and physical mediums. So we have a great library now of the descriptions of the other side and what happens. So when somebody immediately transitions, in other words, they stop using the body, the mind is the same because the mind was never in the body. The mind was using the body. So then the mind just keeps on going. And what happens immediately after depends upon the person. So there are many things that happen. In some circumstances, the person will just leave the body and can actually stand there and look at it, can see it there. We have instances in which somebody passes away suddenly, one where somebody was hit by a truck. And the person just stands there and looks at it. What happened was, in this instance, this is one of the Leslie Flint recordings. The individual who was hit by a truck was immediately out of his body, but he didn't realize it. He thought he was just standing there. He saw a group of people, and they were standing around looking at the ground, and there was a body on the ground. And he said that the body, it just looked like him. It could have been his twin brother, he said. And what was happening was that he was outside of the body looking down at the body, and that it was him laying there. He realized it then, and then they took the body, put it in the ambulance because it had already passed, and he got in the ambulance, and he went with his wife to the hospital. And then a few days later, he went to the morgue, and he said he didn't like it there, so he got out of there real quick. And then he went to his funeral. And they said that they had a horse and carriage that had carried the body because he'd always wanted to have a horse and carriage if he ever passed away. And he said, but at the time when he was watching this happen, he was watching his own funeral. He said, but it was so damn silly because there I was. So in this case, he was there with the body. He was on the earth plane as a mind, and he was not in the body, not using the body, but he was still on the earth plane. In other instances, somebody immediately after passing will be in what looks like an institution, looks like a hospital. It's a reception area. And they wake up there, and then their loved ones come to them there in that reception area. In other instances, they would wake up in a room, and it could be a room that was exactly like the room they had when they were a child. And they wake up in the room, and their loved ones are all assembled around them, and they have their reunion there. So what happens immediately after passing depends on the individual. There are a great variety of ways in which that happens. After that, then from there, we know that they go on to live their lives. They live with the individuals whom they were close to on the earth plane. They will live in houses. They have streets, they have streams, they have mountains. They have all of the same things we have on the earth plane, but it's just on a different vibration. In other words, it's a solid, but it's what we would call matter and energy on the earth plane. But it isn't. There is matter and energy is just a conception. It's consciousness that is giving us the experiences that we call matter and energy. And so they have the same things on the next plane of life that we have on this plane of life. In fact, they say, if you didn't know it, I mean, we are right now on a spiritual plane. The next plane of life looks just like this. You wouldn't know the difference. Some people think they're dreaming and that they're going to wake up anytime now because of the fact that everything is so real there. So we have vast amounts of information about what it's like on the next plane of life. And people can read it. I recommend the book by Anthony Borgia. It's called Life in the World Unseen. And it is the most complete book about the conditions on the afterlife. It's a wonderful book.
So I suppose the argument is that the people who are on the next plane of existence, the next level, whatever we like to call it, the only difference they actually have is they're aware of the existence of this plane, presumably?
That's
So
one
they
of the
know that
differences.
this one
Mm.
exists.
Yeah, that's one of the differences. They do have the knowledge then, because they can go down to, you can go down to the plane below you, and the Earth is below this next plane. So they can come down to the Earth plane, and they can visit their loved ones. In fact, they do visit them. And they also get their thoughts. So there is no separation of the minds, so that if a person on the Earth plane really needs them, is in sorrow, is having a difficult time, then they get that feeling, they get that knowledge, and then they come down to the Earth plane from that next plane of life. So that they are then able to come to us at any time. The other differences in the next plane of life is that there are none of the negatives, none of the things that we associate with accidents, pain, death, those sorts of things. So that's a difference for the next plane of life. It also is, as they describe it, much more wonderful. Everything is at a higher level of experience. So there are colors there that we can't imagine. They have instruments and they have music that we can't imagine. They say that the flowers there, for instance, out when they walk down the fields through what is a countryside, just the same as countryside here, but the flowers are much larger. They don't pick flowers there. There's no need to pick them. But the flowers then not only have an odor to them, they not only have that sense of the odor, but they also have a sound that comes from them. So there's also music. So there are many things about the next plane of life that are much more wonderful than this plane of life. But essentially then they look the same. If you just look at them at a glance, then they would look exactly the same.
So, in terms of this, I'm almost reminded of almost synesthesia here, in the terms that the sounds, and people can see sounds and see smells and everything else as well. On the other side, if I interface with somebody else, or say when somebody passes over and they see their loved ones, their loved ones are manifest as what? As how they remembered them, how they are now. I mean, effectively, you and I are looking at each other now, and I'm seeing you, and you're seeing me, but we're in some kind of form of consensual reality, and we've aged through our lives,
right.
And we are now, in our 60s or whatever we're in, and we're looking at the world in this way. On the other side, are people all the same age? Do they age there, or how does that work?
Yeah, on that plane of life. Now, there is a plane of life that most of the people from the Earth plane go to, and it's been called Summerland by the Theosophists or by the spiritualists. And that's a good term for it. Other people call it level 3. But in this plane of life that most of the people from the Earth plane then go to, the people there have bodies just as solid as the bodies that we have here. But the bodies that are in their 20s and 30s. So they're in their prime of life. And it's not because they decide, I'd like to have a body in its prime of life. I'd like to have a 20 or 30-year-old body. It's the fact that it's just given to them. It just is assumed for them. And they have that body because of the fact that that's desirable to them. So they have that body. If they passed as children, even as stillborn, even as babies not carried to term, they then will grow up on the other side. They go through the growth process and will go through childhood and adolescence into adulthood. So then they do change. Their bodies do change. The person who is in his 20s or 30s then would stay like that for their entire life on the other side. And as far as life on the other side is concerned, on that next plane of life, there are people who come through, one of them in Anthony Borgia's book, that said that he had been on that plane of life for 1,000 years, Earth years. Then we have other people who have come through, Leslie Flint, through those recordings. Confucius has come through, so that's an ancient person. And the people from the Roman Empire have come through from the 1st through the 4th centuries. And so we know that people are staying on that plane of life for as long as they want to. And they are keeping the body that they want to have. So whatever that prime body is, that is the body that they keep on the other side.
Do we then get people from the future? If we can have people from the past like Confucius, are there people from the future that we can interface with?
I have never heard of anyone coming in from the future. So that doesn't mean that it's not possible, as we know that, you know, time is an illusion, as Einstein said. You know, that I don't see why any reason why it wouldn't be true, but I haven't heard of any instances of it.
It's interesting because I'm reminded, I don't know if you've read the science fiction novel by Philip Jose Farmer called To Your Scattered Bodies Go, which was written in the late 1970s. And that has similar rings to this in many, many ways. In terms of then, you touched upon this, but say a fetus is aborted, what happens there? You know, does well, you know, what does happen? What takes place as far as your analysis goes?
What happens is the individual, the mind, the person that we are, you could call it the soul, the mind, the consciousness, that individual then who would have come into and used that body on the earth plane simply goes on and goes into another body, just decides to use another body on the earth plane. There is nothing about harming a fetus that harms the individual. It's impossible to harm the mind. It's impossible to harm the individual. But that person who would become an infant, who would become a born child to that family, is involved with that child and that fetus even before conception. So they're already considering what they want to have happen in their soul's plan and what they decide to happen. So they're already involved, and they then have experiences using that body when they're ready to have them. So they might have pre-birth experiences as a fetus, but it's because they've chosen to enter the earth plane and to have experiences on the earth plane at whatever age they decide. And it can be as a fetus, it can be as a born child, but they are never in the body. They are never, in other words, don't become assimilated by the body or combine with the body, like having two colors of paint combine into a third color. That isn't what happens at all. They use the body so that then they are involved with the fetus before conception. They're involved with it at conception. They're involved with it after conception when it's carried to term. And at any time they can have experiences, but they are never harmed. So in an abortion, the individual is not harmed. The individual would just choose to go on to another family or another mother. And what happens is, though, if a mother has love for that child or regard for that individual that would have been born into that fetus, who would have used that fetus, then that child, that individual, then is actually born in spirit. And we have many instances in which fetuses that have been aborted, the individual that would have been in the fetus is born in spirit and then grows up on the other side. And there are wonderful reunions that we have records of people crossing when they transition from the earth plane, of having a reunion with an aborted child who had grown up on the other side, and then just wonderful, heartwarming reunions that they have with stillbirths, with children who have been aborted, because there is love, and love is the key. Love is what makes it happen. Because we love our pets are there. Anything that we love is there with us then on the next plane of life. And so these individuals do grow up there, but the individual is never in the fetus. There's never a time when the spirit becomes part of the fetus. You can't say that at this point in the fetus's development, it becomes a human being. That simply is not the way it happens. The individual can use the fetus as body, as part of the scenery in the earth play, can use that at any time and chooses to or not to use it, but it's not harmed. The individual is not harmed by an abortion.
Okay, so this seems to have elements of reincarnation, the idea of coming back and transmigration of souls and everything. But one of the things that's fascinating me at the moment is my last book was Opening the Doors of Perception, and I'm moving on. My publisher has actually said, we'd now like to have you look at what is happening the other side in terms of the entities that people encounter in out-of-body experiences, entities within lucid dreaming, entities within DMT experiences and everything else. So it brings the million-dollar question about the existence of evil entities that people seem to be negative in any way. What's your opinion on those?
Yes, there are evil entities. There are, they can either be individuals, they can either be human beings, people who have what we would say evil intent or a socially unacceptable behavior. So we do have those kinds of entities. We also have entities who are never human. They are simply evil entities. So we know that they exist too. And the reason that the evil entities exist who have never been human, the reason that they exist is because they are thought forms. They are created by the animosity and the cruelty and the anger, those thought forms of negative energy. And they're actually created, and they have then a life of their own. In other words, they can influence people on the earth plane. And so we know that they then have a survival instinct. They can manipulate people. And so that's where they come from. We have to realize the fact that we are thought forms, that we are mind. In other words, we're not the body, we're not the scenery, that we're minds. And because of the fact that we're minds, these entities that are evil or negative are thought forms as well. And so then they influence us on this level of mind. So on the level of mind, we can, as we imagine, because of the fact that we are creating this reality consensually, as you say, we are by thought creating this reality. And that means that these evil entities that are thought forms, they are cruelty, they are anger, they are animosity. These thought forms that are evil then enter into this realm of thought forms that we're part of, and they can influence the people on the earth plane. Now the people though who are human beings who had very negative lives, they were filled with violence and cruelty and serial killers and so forth. Those individuals, when they transition out of using the body, they are mind, and they are thought forms, but they're able to stay on the earth plane. So they can stay on the earth plane even though they're not using a body, and they can function on the earth plane, and they can try to influence people on the earth plane. And they're called earthbounds. And the earthbounds then can influence people on the earth plane because they have evil intent. An arsonist will stick around people who like to light fires on the earth plane to try to influence them, to inspire them to light fires, because they can't do it themselves. So this is how they get their kicks. And so then they stay close to the earth plane, they're earthbound, and so they do have influences on people. So we know that happens.
This is intriguing because one of the areas that I touched upon in my last book, which was funnily enough a book on J.B. Priestley, a British writer, but Priestley was quite intrigued by the concept of the tulpa. And of course the tulpa is a thought form that is created by people creating things, because Aleister Crowley, the famous British black magician in raised commas, used to have this term called an egregore, where you could create a kind of a thought form. And of course we have the famous case, was it Philip in Toronto, where a group of people manifested an entity, a 17th century English nobleman who had never actually existed, but seemed to take on something in himself. Now, if the argument is that this reality is part of a multi-nested reality, and within those reality, this is a form of simulation we are living within, and we can be embodied in the simulation, we're getting into some very, very interesting areas, because this is the area that science is moving in terms of the idea of the holographic nature of reality, the way in which reality seems to be created by the act of observation, as we know in quantum physics, we know from the Copenhagen interpretation. So we're moving into some very, very interesting areas here. Now, I'm very aware of time, and unfortunately we lost a lot of time at the start. But what I'd like to do now for the final few minutes, and I'm really sorry about this, we've run out of some time here, but I think we'll just get you back, because I think it's important we continue with these ideas, is your Afterlife Research and Education Institute. Can you tell myself and the listeners a little bit about the organization, and indeed your symposium in September in the States, and what's going to be happening there? Because I'm sure a lot of people will be very interested in the things you're saying here.
We formed the Afterlife Research and Education Institute because there are many of the researchers now who are helping people to learn how to have afterlife communications. They're discovering new methods of having afterlife communications. We're using instrumental transcommunication, we're reusing technological devices, we're actually recording the voices of people from the other side, and we can communicate with them through these recordings. We're using psychotherapists. We're teaching psychotherapists how to have their clients have afterlife communications while they're sitting in their offices. We're teaching mental mediums. We're teaching physical mediums where they sit in a room and they have materializations, or they have objects moving in the room, or people speaking through a direct voice. In other words, the voice is coming out of the air. So there are many of these ways of communicating with people on the other side. And the people who are developing these and refining them and teaching people how to use them are working out of their dining rooms. You know, they just can't find funding. Where do you find funding? You go out to a foundation and say, listen, we're talking to the dead and we'd like to have you give us some money for it. And we just can't find it. So we formed the Afterlife Research and Education Institute to support these people. We're trying to find funding for them. We're trying to find ways of helping them to get the resources to network with each other. And we're holding a symposium in September in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we're bringing together 30 people who are experts in the field of afterlife communication. And they have some things to do with the transition from the body into the next realm of life. They have things to do with communicating with people in the afterlife. They're the pioneers who are doing this work. And these 30 experts are going to be coming together, and they're going to be speaking with each other about what they're doing to network, to fertilize each other. And at the same time, we're having presentations open to the public. So they'll speak to the public in presentations. And as they speak to the public in presentations, they'll be sharing with each other, but they'll also be educating people. So we want people to come to the symposium to learn about it, to become involved. Membership in the AREI, Afterlife Research and Education Institute, is open. Anybody can become involved in it. And if anybody has any funding sources that we can get to the researchers, we're trying to do that now. But the symposium is our big event. That's where we're going to bring everybody together. We're planning on having 800 people at the symposium. And all of these people then are going to be speaking to each other. It's a wonderful time of camaraderie and sharing and discovering things that are going to be happening. So it's a very exciting time. And you can learn about that at afterlifesymposium.org. That's afterlifesymposium.org. The institute is at afterlifeinstitute.org. So easy to find, and we welcome anybody to have dialogue with us about either the institute or about the symposium or about just communicating with your loved ones. So we would invite anybody to contact us at any time.
Wonderful, because when I was doing research, as you probably know, I wrote a book with Irvin Laszlo called Mortal Mind, and quite a few of the areas that I was researching there was very much directly related to the stuff you're talking about here, like EVP and various other things. And I was delighted to discover that I'd obviously missed out that you'd written one of the books that I'd researched in great detail, the Allan Botkin book, Induced Afterlife Death Communications.
Yeah.
You were very much the co-author of that book. And I strongly advise anybody who is interested in these things to really check out this book, because it has some very, very interesting ideas in it. And it's subtly convincing. And I think that's what I like about your work, is that it has this kind of, you convince by logic and by sense and by absolute experiences, which I think is very important, because I've worked a lot with individuals who work at in spiritualism here in the UK, various individuals that I know seem to be in communication with a greater something. And as you know, my position is subtly different to your own, but I think the truth lies in the bits in the middle. As we were discussing earlier, there's a huge Venn diagram here, and the truth is there. It's just that scientism is not allowing us to carry things forward because it doesn't fit in with the overall paradigm. And because it doesn't fit in with the paradigm as we understand it to be, it's been rejected. And that is silly, because we are trying to understand the universe, the greater universe, and how the universe functions. Therefore, to just say, because I don't agree with something, doesn't mean it's necessarily true. You know, that's being incredibly parochial and very, very dangerous, I think.
Yeah.
Because we need to understand, and that's the important thing. Right, Craig, thank you very much for your involvement here. I think, you know, Dear and I would probably be delighted to have you back, because I think because we lost the time at the start, it was most unfortunate. so many questions in my mind that
Yeah.
we can carry forward. So thank you very much for your time here.
Yeah.
And look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Yeah.
And to everybody else, thanks again for listening in or watching this. We have a whole series of guests coming forward throughout the year. And I'm also hoping maybe at some stage get some form of using this software that we're using at the moment. We could have some kind of conference using Zoom whereby we could have individuals from around the world to discuss these issues in some kind of online symposium, because I think that would really work. But the best of luck for your conference in the future. I'm sure it will be absolutely fascinating. And I'm hoping that some of the listeners out there or some of the watchers, I never know quite what to call the people that listen to this, will join in. And Scottsdale is a place I've always wanted to go to. One of my favorite artists, Steve Hanks, used to have a studio in Scottsdale, and I used to buy his limited prints many, many years ago. So it's one of these places I've always wanted to go to. So Craig, thank you very much. Is there any other bits and pieces if people want to contact you directly? Is there any forms of communication you can suggest as well?
Yeah, I invite anybody to contact me. I'm anxious to answer questions and to get people involved. So you can send me an email if you want to at r.craig.hogan@afterlifeinstitute.org, and go ahead and send it to anything to me, because I would very much like to correspond with you.
Wonderful, because I think in the final analysis, what is important here is evidence. And if we have evidence, if there are individuals out there that have had communications with people who have passed over, and those communications involve information that they could not possibly, or you could not have possibly known, this is the power. All we need is the data and the proof. You know, effectively, you know, we are trying to just understand this, as Teilhard de Chardin said, you know, we are spiritual beings having a physical life. What we're trying to understand is to understand the greater thing. And this is all we're trying to do. We're not trying to trip up science. We're not trying to do anything like that. We're just trying to understand. And I think that is what's most important.
Yes, agreed.
Craig, thank you very much for joining this afternoon. As always, thank you to Dia Nunez in the background there in Denver, Colorado, who without her help and ministrations, this would not happen. So thank you very much. And we're speaking to you all again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.